We're back for another conversation with my loving husband, Scott. This month, he has embarked on a journey of reflection, and he's here to share his thoughts.
Yeah, it's nice to be here. Yeah.
Hi.
Hi. Yeah.
So, why did you choose reflection as one of your monthly foundations?
Yeah. So I think, I don't know, there's this funny kind of idea when you go through each of the foundations, there's sort of a case to be made for why it's like the most important one, right? So I think when we were talking about fitness in the course that we have with this, I think the first lesson we had was sort of like why fitness was the first foundation. And I make this case that, your health, the health of your body is very important for all the other parts of your life. And staying in good shape or exercising regularly is like one of the best lifestyle investments you can make in that regard. And so there was like that case for why fitness was sort of like, not the most important one, but at least the first one in that regard. So here we are. This is month 8. So, definitely not the first one in the list. But again, there's a case to be made for why reflection is the most important one. And the way I would put it is that kind of your entire experience of life, from how you feel to what you think about to, your life itself, is really just sort of how you think about things. It's just sort of what you're thinking, how you're interpreting stuff as it goes. And so if you want to not only be happy and enjoy your life, but also make changes, the sort of first kind of fundamental ingredient is like, well, how are you interpreting things? How are you thinking about those things? And if the way you're interpreting stuff, the way you're thinking about it has this sort of distortion or this blind spot or this sort of destructive cycle of, you think something and you do something and you get bad results and then it just sort of gets you locked in this pattern, it can be very difficult to change anything else. So I think, it's, again, like to go back to that idea, there's a case to be made that reflection is really sort of underpins a lot of the other foundations. So that was one reason. The other reason was simply that when I was creating the list of foundations, I was thinking in terms of what are kind of like useful life habits to sustain this. And so I think the idea of having some kind of reflective practice. Now, there's different reflective practices. It doesn't have to be the one that I'm suggesting here, but there's having some kind of reflective practice is a useful kind of remedy. It gives you a chance to sort of step back, look at that lens that you're looking at life, see if there's some distortions in it, see if there's some places where you can make improvements and work on it again. And so the technique that I kind of settled upon as being the keystone habit for this month for myself and for the people who are following the course was daily journaling. And this isn't because other reflective practices are worse. Obviously, mindfulness meditation is super popular now. People who are of a religious bent, obviously things like scriptural study or prayer is very important to those people. If you are, in a kind of good, secure relationship, even just having deep conversations with your partner can fulfill some of that role. But to me, journaling had the fewest prerequisites, and it was the one that was kind of like the easiest to get started doing. So meditation, you often have to go on a retreat or get some practice before you can even tolerably do it. Whereas, just opening up a blank notebook or a blank Word document and just writing stuff as it occurs to you, it's pretty accessible, and I think it's also pretty effective.
And what do you write about? What are, like, do you write just a word of like how you're feeling today? Do you write a sentence of like, this is what happened today? Or do you write about your problems? Like, how do you come up with the thoughts of what you want to write?
Yeah, so I think there's lots of different structuring techniques for journaling. I know gratitude journaling, for instance, is something that's really popular these days, which is like, it has a specific intention. I'm going to write about things I'm grateful for. Right. And that can be valuable because just naturally we're sort of a problem-oriented species. So saying things like, these things are good in my life is a good way to promote well-being and also make us, a little bit more humble and maybe take care of the things that are good in our life. But for me, I feel like it's not so much that you want to have a very specific technique. I think gratitude journaling can be great, but I think there's lots of different things that you can get from writing. And so I usually recommend people to write whatever they feel like writing. So if you want to talk about what you did today, what went right, what went wrong, kind of classic journal entry style, you can do that. If you want to talk about something that's going to happen in the future, a plan you want to make, a problem you want to solve, you can write about that. You can even just sort of write out your emotions, how you're feeling about things. So if you're really anxious about something or worried or scared or even just really happy, you can express yourself in this way. So there's lots and lots of different journaling techniques. If you're kind of interested in like the full gamut of these are all the things you can write about and all the different ways you can do it, just for some inspiration, I do really recommend the book, The New Diary. That was one that sort of encouraged people to think of sort of self-expression and this sort of expressive writing as being a technique for self-improvement, as opposed to, you know, the way you think of a diary where it's sort of like the weather was this and John came over today or this kind of thing, you know, that would have been something my grandmother would have done decades ago. And so I think the right way to get started with it is just to write anything and not to inhibit yourself too much with like, I have to follow this template.
But there's also nothing wrong with writing what happened today either.
Yeah.
Just for your own memories, or like writing out what happened can also make you think about how you're feeling about the things that happened, right? And
definitely
kind of go on about that. Oftentimes when I read something that's very meaningful or inspiring to me or really resonates with me, I want to like write it somewhere else to reference it. So I feel like a journal for me would be really good for things like that, because I just want to keep it there to like remind myself in the future of something that I really thought about. Do you think that journaling is beneficial for a specific type of person, or like somebody that has a lot of anxiety, or somebody that's, I don't know, a deep thinker, or like, do you think like everyone can benefit from journaling?
I think everyone can benefit. I think that journaling works best when you have fewer other outlets for that kind of self-reflection. So as we talked about earlier, you know, if you are someone who like the way you reminisce, deal with your problems, plan, do this kind of thinking is through conversation with someone, then maybe you need journaling a little less. And so for me, for instance, if I look at my life, I had a real period of where I did a lot of journaling kind of in my late adolescence, early 20s. And this was often a period of time where like, you know, I'd have some friends, but maybe I don't feel like I can really talk with them openly about all of the things that I'm working on.
Yeah.
And then, you know, when I got a bit older, having more close relationships, I feel like some of those functions that I was writing down in the journal came from having these conversations. But I do think that it's a practice that if you start it, you can take it in lots of different directions and get benefit in lots of different ways. So for me, I think the benefit that you get depends on what kinds of entries you do. But if you are in the general habit of writing, you just kind of have this tool that you can use for lots of different problems. So sometimes in your life, that's going to be, you know, working through your thoughts and emotions or dealing with something that's happened. In other cases, it's going to be planning and goal setting and, you know, maintaining your motivation. In another part of your life, maybe it is just like being grateful and this kind of thing. So I try to think of, it's not so much that journaling in general does the same thing for everyone who does it, but I think it's a tool that is still underused. I think most people don't regularly keep a journal, even if they occasionally write things.
Yeah, and I've heard of a lot of people doing something that's like a morning pages, where they wake up in the morning and they give themselves the time to just sit down and just write down all their thoughts, and just in one place to just organize themselves and set themselves up for success in the day. But also I've heard of people doing like mood boards, or you know, like just plan for, I really want this to happen this year. And when you kind of creatively put it on a board and, you know, put like pictures and things like that, you kind of work towards something, and it can be very inspirational. But I also find that sometimes when we have a problem, or if we have even like a problem with somebody else, or we're thinking about something that we've heard or somebody else has told us something, we tend to think about it, and the things that we're unsure of, we seem to sort of fill in the blanks. And that can make us even more anxious. Yeah. Instead of really kind of sitting down and putting it on paper and being like, okay, is this even a thing? Right?
Yeah. I mean, I think again, like just journaling on its own just the idea of, okay, I'm just going to write something. It does really matter kind of what intention you bring to it, the kind of result you're going to get. But there is a lot of diversity of methods, sort of what we were talking about. But I think I think for me, one of the strongest cases for it is that when you are in your kind of normal flow of thoughts, especially as you're talking about if you're anxious or you're ruminating about something, there is a sense in which your thoughts just kind of come one after another. So, you may not even kind of be self-aware that you're doing this, but that guy who cut you off in traffic, you have this kind of movie you're playing in your head.
You're arguing with them in your head almost, right?
Yeah.
And they're not even there. Nothing is really happening, but in your head, it's like a war, right?
You're engaged in some kind of fantasy simulation of confronting them, or you're thinking about something that, maybe someone you're close to said something rude to you, and then your head's spinning off in some direction, again, creating scenarios. This is, I think, a major property of the human mind. But the problem is that whenever you have some kind of system where one thought leads to another thought, which is how our brains work, there is this chance to get caught in loops. Because you, let's say, have some kind of stimulus from the outside makes you have some anxious thought. And then that anxious thought creates feelings of anxiety, which are not only in sort of non-conscious parts of your brain, sort of detecting threats, but also, your body physically changes. You get sort of aroused, you get sort of agitated. And this state can perpetuate more anxious thoughts. So you're more likely to think of other things that make you anxious or elaborate on that anxious situation and kind of repeat into it. And so obviously if you're journaling and you just have this idea of I'm just going to pour all my anxieties out into this journal, you might just make it worse. You might just get yourself working up more. Yeah. But one of the things I like about doing journaling is that when I'm writing about a problem I'm facing, is that you write for a little bit, get it out, and then you reread what you wrote, and very often you're sort of but that's, you have a more skeptical look at what you were saying. Whereas in normal, just kind of casual thought, those thoughts have already kind of gone away and you're on to the next thought before you're able to really critically evaluate them. So I think this ability to sort of interrogate your own thinking is valuable. And I've used this a lot of times when I've dealt with, let's say, a frustrating problem, and I'll just sort of be explaining kind of to myself why this situation is difficult or unfair, or why I'm not able to do what I want to do. And then as I start writing, I'm kind of but that's not entirely true. And then I end up kind of convincing myself that actually maybe things aren't so bad. So I think, again, this idea of writing as kind of expanding the space of self-awareness, I think is very valuable. So that's one of the reasons that I picked journaling as a potential technique, because it has that capacity to be so-and-so is always so mean to me. And then you write it down and you're well, actually, they're not always so mean to me. You know what I mean? And then you kind of end up talking yourself out of some of the more extreme views that you might have arrived at if you just played out that mental scenario of you fighting with this person. Yeah.
Totally. Yeah. And it can be very healing too, right? So it was about 8 years ago, you went on a meditation retreat.
Was it 8 years ago? Oh my
I
goodness,
don't know.
yeah.
When,
yeah, probably. But yeah.
Before the kids, before we got married.
Yeah, that's true, yeah.
And you were there for...
Time flies.
For a week, right?
10 days, yeah.
10 days.
Yeah.
When you look back now, do you feel like that was a good experience for you? What did you take from that?
Well, I feel like the meditation retreat experience is something that I would recommend for all people at least once in their life, just because it's so outside the normal day-to-day experience that you have that I think it's very difficult to have that as a reference point for things. It's a little bit like if you've never left the country and you go on one trip in your life, you're like, oh wow, things are so different here. They use different money and the signs are different and stuff. I think the thing we don't realize is that we're always kind of a resident of our own minds, of our own way of thinking things, of our own flow of our life. So even if you go to another country, there you go, but you're still you, right? And so I think the meditation retreat, not that you disassociate from yourself, but because it puts such an extreme restriction on kind of what you're able to do and what you're focusing on, that you really, I think, do shift to thinking about things differently over that time period. Now, I think it is difficult. I know a lot of people who did the 10-day retreat that, it was difficult for them to last because the way these retreats work. So I did one that was one of the SN Goenka ones. If anyone here knows about meditation retreats, they'll know which ones I'm talking about. But the basic idea is 10 days. You're not allowed to talk to anyone. You're only eating like meal in the morning, meal in the afternoon. I think for the beginners, they let them eat a little bit in the evening, but once you've done it before, you're not supposed to be eating in the evening either. You wake up at, I want to say 4:30 a.m., but maybe I'm wrong, but it's super early. And you meditate like maybe 10 hours of the day. And if you've ever done like one of these little stopwatch meditation things before on your phone, a lot of people, sitting still and just focusing on your breath for 20 minutes is hard. So sitting in like, this kind of lotus posture, which for Westerners who aren't used to chairs without backs, it can be quite uncomfortable for like 2 hours straight. It requires some endurance to get through. But I think one of the advantages of going through this experience, and I would say relatedly sort of mindfulness, is that it gives you an opportunity to quiet your environment to the point where you can notice things about yourself. And so I think mindfulness, is a very powerful technique. I don't want to suggest that everyone needs to be meditating for an hour every day. And as I said, I didn't pick meditation for the Keystone Habit for this month, in part because I feel like you need a certain level of skill to benefit from it. But I think the ability to sort of at least be in the back of your head aware of like, just shift out and be like, okay, I'm just aware of what's going on right now. And that, kind of all the things that I'm worried about, stressed about, feeling are in some sense kind of a projection or an interpretation of what's going on. I think it's a very useful perspective shift. Sounds like a really trivial example, but if you've ever seen those magic eyes, the ones where you like go cross-eyed, it turns 3D, there's a kind of trick to it that like if you look at them, you can stare at them for a really long time and not be able to make it 3D. But then once you kind of like know what to do, you can like instantly pop the pictures and make them look 3D. And so it's this kind of like, it's almost perceptual. It's this sort of like shift of like, oh yes, but really this is kind of, I don't want to say made up, but like you're sort of layering on your own interpretation on what's going on. And if you really look at what's going on, that's not inherent in what the situation is. And so I think that the mindfulness in general is sort of about that practice, is about this kind of shift to like, not obviously things like our relationship problems and your, problems in life with career and work and these kind of things are inherently abstract. So when you do this, you kind of, sense their kind of basic unreality. But I think even more deeply things like, if you have a headache, for instance, I know they use mindfulness a lot for pain therapy, but if you have a headache and you're really uncomfortable and the headache is awful and you're kind of tearing at yourself for like how much you dislike this situation. But if you can kind of train yourself to just really pay attention to what exactly you're feeling, like don't look away from it, but like really pay attention to it. You often realize that the thing that felt really painful is actually like not so painful. Like it's kind of this weird distance you get from those sensations. And so I think there's a similar kind of perspective shift that accompanies mindfulness. So I definitely think it's a very useful skill. Now, I'm not like a daily meditator or regular meditator, so I know there's a lot of people who...
For a while you were, though.
You
were meditating every day.
Yeah, but only for like, I would say maybe like 4 or 5 months after the retreat. It was not that long a time period. I think it's something that I have friends that are like really devoted to it and I respect them for it, but it's also something that I feel like, it's not something that I do regularly these days, but I feel like having been through that experience, I think it's still a useful kind of mindset to carry through in your life, even if you're not always zen about everything, as I certainly am not.
But I mean, and also sometimes things that happen in life, like they're pretty easy, and things are just kind of going with the flow, and you're going through your routine, and and then sometimes things happen that really we don't have control of, right? And just how to deal with those types of situations, it can be tricky, and you can take a toll on you emotionally, and even with your own physical health as well, right? Like putting too much stress on your body, not being able to control what you're feeling and your emotions. I think it can make life very difficult.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there's always this tension. I think it is self-reflection, but in general in life, between how much you should be striving for things or attempting to like change or improve or solve a problem or deal with things, and how much you should just kind of be accepting of the way things are. And I don't think there's ever a right answer there. I think, there's obviously a few things that if you like, did the research, you would be like, well, there's almost no chance of me changing this, so I should probably accept it. Or this is the kind of thing that if you did Y, you'd be able to change. And so we can all identify those extremes, but I feel like a lot of our major life concerns are always in a bit of this middle ground where, they're modifiable to some extent, but there's some sense that they might be durable and you have to accept them. And so I think being able to have both tools in your pocket, I guess I would say, we were talking about mindfulness, which is very much on this sort of acceptance idea. But one of the other things that I read this month, which, was another kind of counterpart philosophy that I think is very important, is cognitive behavioral therapy. This is sort of the gold standard for psychotherapy, but it works the same way, that it's a kind of approach for like recognizing these patterns of thinking and trying to like, not just sort of wishful thinking, I'm going to just think positively, but attempting to like, okay, if you're having really unconstructive thoughts about things, challenging some of those assumptions, doing sort of experiments to change things. So it's a little bit more on the changing things, and the mindfulness is a little bit more on the accepting things, although there is overlap between these kinds of broad approaches. And I think if you have these sorts of tools at your disposal, you can kind of, in the situation, like, is this something that I'm going to try to change, or is this something I'm going to accept? And then like whatever you do with it, you're able to, not have it be as big a problem for you in your life, whether or not you're going to fix it or whether or not you're going to try to make peace with it.
Right. You read a few other books that I'd appreciate some summary of, because they look very interesting. So you read Thinking Fast and Slow.
Yeah.
And in here he has this idea of like asking yourself, how happy are you in life versus how do I feel right now?
Yeah,
right?
So this is, of course, the late Daniel Kahneman. He wrote a best-selling book, Thinking Fast and Slow. He also won a Nobel Prize in economics for kind of founding the field of behavioral economics. Right. And he was a psychologist from Israel who had just this tremendous influence on a lot of different fields in psychology. His early work was on kind of attention and what it means to pay attention to things and some of the kind of findings with that. But I think the work he's most known for is with cognitive biases, or basically the ways that our thinking leads us astray. And so in Thinking Fast and Slow, he suggests that we can broadly think of our mind as kind of having two different systems. So system one is a fast, quick, intuitive, automatic, effortless system that results in like kind of making quick, stereotypical snap judgments of things. It allows us to instantly respond to hard questions by kind of substituting them with an easier question. And this is largely how we operate through life. And then system two is a kind of slow, plodding, effortful, calculating, combining different pieces of information to figure out the right answer. His example is like when you hear 2 + 2 = 4, that's system one. When you have to say 57 times 38 and come up with the answer, that's system two. So that's sort of like the articulation of it. And this theme of the system one, system two goes throughout this work. And towards the end of his career, he did a lot of work on happiness and well-being. And one of the things he found is that depending on how you measure it, happiness has kind of two very different meanings. And one of them is your sort of, if I ask you, how are you doing as a whole, you're going to reflect over the totality of your life, think about yourself versus other people, think back to some representative experiences. You're going to be in this sort of remembering mode of remembering your life, of thinking about it as a whole. Versus if I say, how are you feeling right now? You're going to think about very different things. And so what he showed was that there's all these paradoxes that arise where you can kind of show that like these two things can't rationally be combined the way that someone might expect. If we were rational creatures, you would expect that like, well, the remembering self should be kind of the integral of all the experiences. And so what he shows is that, like, for instance, if you ask someone about an unpleasant experience, such as sticking your hand in a bath of really cold ice water, and you get them to put it in for 10 minutes in really cold water, or you get them to put it in 10 minutes of really cold water, and then you raise the water temperature ever so slightly, so it's still painful, but not as painful for the last like 3 minutes, they will rate the longer experience as having been a better, more pleasurable experience than the first one, because mostly what you remember from an event is sort of the peak badness it had, how it started and how it ends. You have kind of no duration sense of it. So because the last one, even though it has the same sort of total bad experience, because you tack on a slightly less bad experience towards the end, you evaluate it better, even though that kind of doesn't make sense. Or another example he gives is someone who had bought a record of some classical musician, and they're listening to the whole symphony, and it's just ecstatic for them because they're this classical music lover. And then they found out that there was a scratch right at the end, and right as the music song, the symphony's about to end, it's like this. And the guy made the kind of offhand comment, it just ruined the whole experience for me.
No.
And his point was, well, it can't have ruined the whole experience for you, because the first 50 minutes where you were ecstatically enjoying it, like, it can't undo that, right? But of course, that's not how our minds work. So if you have a relationship with someone which was spectacular and beautiful, and you loved them so much, and then at the end, they cheat on you or treat you really badly, or run away, or this kind of thing, you might say, oh, the whole relationship was bad now. And so I think this kind of it's very interesting to think about Kahneman's work in terms of like, well, how does our mind work? What are all the kind of kludges and ways that it deviates from how an ideal thinker would behave? Because it does have very real consequences. We make bad decisions, we make bad judgments as a result. But his work on happiness, I think it's very interesting, because it's an area where Kahneman himself changed his mind. So when he started doing this research, he kind of had the view that the experiential self, or like the kind of how do you feel in the moment, summated over time, was like the real vision of happiness. And your remembering self, or like your kind of what you think about your life, is a kind of flawed, irrational proxy for that. And he kind of later abandoned that view, although I know some other psychologists that continue to kind of champion that view. But he kind of abandoned that view because he said, like, it's sort of crazy for psychology to so wildly differ from what people say they want in their lives, that, if psychology says what you really should want is just to be like sipping margaritas poolside forever and ever and ever and just enjoying the sunshine, but people actually want to have meaningful relationships and heartbreaks and challenges and,
that
triumphs.
They have to resolve.
And to have this kind of life that doesn't look like that, I think it's interesting sort of as a matter of philosophy. But I think his work in Thinking Fast and Slow, it has been something that's been very thought-provoking, that has, really influenced how I think about my own life and my own thinking.
Oh, gosh. Deep. That's deep. So what about The Artist's Way by Julia Cameron? Yeah,
so this is a very popular book that's been around for a long time. And this is where the daily pages idea comes from, that, she sort of had this kind of self-help book about becoming more creative. And one of the main things that she suggested was doing these morning pages, which is very similar to the journaling idea of just kind of like stream of consciousness, writing out your thoughts on loose leaf for, a period of time in the morning. And that this would just have to be like a regular practice. And so I think this has inspired a lot of people with journaling. I think it was one of the first kind of books that really proposed this style of kind of, you're just getting it all out there approach to it. And her sort of mission is more about how to live creatively, or how to be, have good ideas, have creative ideas. And a lot of her advice, I would say, basically comes down to how do you create a safe environment so that you can feel confident and trust yourself, which I think broadly corresponds to what I understand from other areas of creativity research, that I think people tend to be more creative, more open when you have this feeling of psychological security. You're a little bit more safe. It makes you want to try out new ideas. And so it's sort of funny because, like, they always say, necessity is the mother of invention. And that's really not true. I think it's very much the case that we have creative ideas. We are willing to take risks when we feel a broad sense of safety. When we feel danger, when we feel attacked, criticized, there's a kind of contraction. Like we want to make sure we do everything right and not like take big risks on things that might fail. And so her book suggests this journaling technique as a method for creativity, which I think just shows you how much variety you can get from this technique from journaling.
Yeah, I think when we look back when we're kids and we feel that safety and we don't have these responsibilities weighing on us, and we feel way more creative. We can just do everything that we want to do. And then as we age and we become adults, I think you do get more criticism, and I think more fears start to form. And I think you're gonna stop to take as many risks. But I think that's very important.
But I think it can go both ways. I think there's lots of people who have felt constrained for much of their life, and then sort of later in life they have a kind of creative awakening that comes from this. So I think, again, not to say that you keep your journal regularly and you're going to come up with the next Oscar-winning movie or something like that, but I do think that a regular reflective practice can assist with creativity, among the many other benefits.
So this is a little bit more of a simple question, but what do you think, paper or electronic?
I used to do mostly like Word document on my computer, and I haven't had a number of paper journals, and I think there is some benefits to paper in just that you have a little bit less constraints on the form. So when you're typing in a Word document, it very much constrains you to this sort of like linear text and writing words. Whereas if you're journaling on paper, you can start drawing pictures and put the lines in different places. And so it can be a bit freer in that sense. I also know people who find that doing things longhand is beneficial for them because you have to write much slower. So it kind of goes back to our original idea of like being able to be self-reflective. Well, if you're writing down at like the fifth the speed you can talk, or a fifth the speed you can think your thoughts, then you just have so much more time to examine what you're actually putting down. And that can be beneficial. But for me, I have been mostly digital, and I think part of that's informed by the fact that I do most of my writing digitally. So for me, I always feel like most comfortable writing things, but I don't know whether that'd be true for most people, because I think, aside from emails, most people are not doing a ton of writing, whereas that's what I spend most of my day doing.
Yeah. And what are your thoughts about Stoicism?
Oh, well, one of the books that I finally got around to reading this month was Meditations by Marcus Aurelius. And this is a hugely popular book.
It is.
This is a classic. I mean, it was written by the Roman Emperor himself thousands of years ago, and it's informed many, philosophies since, including early Christianity. And so it's really hard to say you're not a huge fan of a book. But I honestly, when I was reading the book, I was a little disappointed, to be honest, because I've read a lot of more Buddhist books, which are quite similar to Stoicism. They have a very similar kind of perspective and attitude. I feel like there's a lot of overlap in the philosophies, but I felt like a lot of the book, and again, admittedly, this is not Marcus Aurelius even writing a book to other people. He's writing this to himself. They're sort of essentially defensive. So they're kind of focused much more on like protecting yourself from bad emotions, bad things happening. He's always reminding yourself that you're going to die, so it doesn't matter anyways. Like this is just a frequent refrain for him. And I feel like that can be very beneficial, but I also felt like it was a little one-sided. Now, I'm sure the people who are like correctly understand Stoicism are going to be showing up in the comments to explain to me why I'm wrong. But I feel like these subjective impressions are important, because when you encounter philosophies, you encounter different perspectives. I think a lot of what does matter is how it kind of captivates and motivates your life and this kind of thing. And so this was an interesting kind of counterpoint, because I was expecting to be more inspired, be more inspired for it than I actually was. But certainly, it has a lot of popular adherents who are more intelligent and successful than me. So don't leave my word as the final comment on that book.
Interesting. And what about the book, What You Can Change and What You Can't?
Yeah, this is a short book. I remember reading it years ago. So it's by the positive psychologist, Martin Seligman. And he just kind of goes through some of the things that, from research we show that is like broadly modifiable versus not modifiable. And so he's optimistic about changing things like anxiety and depression because of the success of things like cognitive behavioral therapy. He's more negative on the idea of, being able to change, let's say, your fundamental gender identity or sexuality. He believes these are things that, like, once you are imprinted with something at a young age, this is something that doesn't usually change. So if someone thinks that they're they have a different gender identity when they're young, you're probably not going to talk them out of it when they're older. So this is one of his contributions based on research. He also is very pessimistic about dieting generally, because I think if you look at the research on diets, very few people manage to sustain weight loss long term. Now, of course, this is written before things like Ozempic and semaglutide and this kind of stuff, which is a treatment. But I mean, it is an area where I think this broad idea of like, what can you change? What can you accept? It goes back to what we were talking about earlier about, how much should you try to do one or the other? And I do think sometimes there are some facts on the ground where we can say, okay, well, of the 100 people who try this, how many succeed at making a change versus how many don't? And so even if you could imagine a world where it's better to solve your problem than to accept it, if you're in a situation where 99% of the time people don't solve that kind of problem, it does change, I think, the trade-off point for doing this. So I think Martin Seligman's work is, again, not the final word on any of these things, but he does bring up a lot of research on various sort of aspects of psychology that that might be relevant for making those sorts of decisions.
Yeah, but aren't you better off trying anyway? If let's say if you're overweight and you want to change your lifestyle and you want to lose weight, having the idea of well, the chances are that I won't.
Well, I mean, again, I think the whole idea about whether or not you're better off striving or accepting is based on this kind of probability, because you can imagine doing something, putting a lot of effort into it versus accepting it does create some kind of psychic cost. If you have to do something that you're for sure going to fail at, it could be very discouraging. You could be, it could eat up a lot of your time, a lot of your energy. So, I mean, I don't think that it's the case that the costs and benefits of striving versus settling are equivalent. So it's not you do have to actually look at, what are the ups and downs of each, but definitely the sort of facts on the ground about how successful something is likely to be does make a difference.
So in the Scout Mindset by Julie Galef, you said that she compares two styles of thinking, the soldiers and the scouts.
Yeah. So if you think of a military metaphor, the soldiers are the ones who do battle. They have to defend their perspective. They have to defend what they're doing. And the scouts are the ones who have to go out and gather information. And so her argument is that most of us, when we think about our beliefs and our thoughts and our ideas, act like soldiers. We want to defend our political viewpoint. We want to defend our ideas. We want to, attack the other person's weaknesses. Essentially, we try to look for ways that other people are wrong and that we're right, and to justify our own beliefs about things. And she argues that there's another mindset you could have, which is this scout mindset, which is where you want to accurately survey what the facts are. So even if the enemy has a huge army just over the hill and they're going to attack you, you don't want to be saying, oh, well, they're probably not that strong. They're probably weak. You want to know that information, because that's what you do as a scout. You want to bring that intelligence back to the camp so you can make the correct decisions. And so this book, The Scout Mindset, came out a couple years ago, and I think it's really a good summary of the kind of rationalist community. This was a community that began online around this idea of how do you have more accurate beliefs, more true beliefs. And so it's a sort of a unique subculture. There's a lot of really nerdy stuff, like people using Bayes' rule to update their beliefs and all this kind of thing. But I think there's also a lot beneficial to it, because it is, in some ways, I think it's a bit of a radical philosophy, because I think for a lot of us, we think about our beliefs in terms of, is it instrumental? So even if you're in the kind of broadly self-help world, you'll read a lot of books about like why you need to think positive, right? Because thinking positive, if you think negative, you're not going to achieve your goals. If you think positive, you're going to achieve them. And you need to be confident, and you need to be optimistic, and you need to have constructive beliefs. And this idea that like, you know, it's the instrumental value of our beliefs rather than their sort of ground level accuracy that really matters is pervasive everywhere. I think there's a lot of prominent psychologists who would endorse it to some extent. Daniel Kahneman, in his book Thinking Fast and Slow, essentially makes this idea that it's maybe adaptive, that we have this sort of optimism bias, because, you know, the creature that walks around doubting itself all the time is the one that gets, doesn't have enough energy to actually do what's important. Whereas Galef makes, I think, pretty prominently the rationalist point of view, this other side of the argument that, well, no, yes, it is the case that sometimes reality is pessimistic, but if you actually know the facts on the ground, you can make better decisions. So, you know, she uses the example of some startup founders. I think it was Jeff Bezos was one of them, who, when he was asked like how likely he pegged Amazon's success at, he said, I forget what it was, the percentage, but I think he said that he thought it only had about a 10% chance of being successful.
Really?
And which sounds crazy. Like, how can you start a company where it has a 10% chance of being successful? But it was just because Jeff Bezos' idea was that, well, even if this has a 10% chance of working, it might be Amazon, right? So I think this is kind of a useful counterpoint to the idea that, like, to be a successful entrepreneur, you have to be like 100% my project's going to succeed. Well, I mean, most new businesses don't succeed. And so it's interesting that, you know, one of the most successful entrepreneurs of our era kind of very explicitly had a different mindset. And so I think, personally, I don't have a really strong definitive, it's more important to be instrumental, more important to be objective or accurate about things. I think, again, the truth probably depends on how much your beliefs have kind of like consequences for the decisions you make. But I lean towards Galef's position in a lot of things. And definitely when I'm talking to students or talking to people who read my blog, I very much encourage people to adopt kind of a more realistic attitude towards things, simply because I think if you can get motivated on a realistic basis, it's much more consistent and stable. And what I find a lot of people struggle with is that they can like hype themselves up about something, but because they haven't really figured out how it's going to work, it's not like, oh yes, but this would definitely work if I did it, then they vacillate and then they, you know, back down on those plans. And so I think, you know, even though there may be some exceptions where you do want to be someone who has faith and dogmatism, and I think the pure rationalist approach is maybe not sustainable for all people in all situations, I think there is something very beneficial about the kind of quest that Galef puts forth, which is how do you actually get accurate beliefs, even if they're not necessarily what you want to hear or what is like the nicest thing to believe about the world.
Yeah, and I think oftentimes people get very scared to fail, and that makes them not go for, you know, not take risks, right? Yeah.
Well, and I mean, I think it's a big part of it is that if you are kind of purposefully sort of distorting what you think about the world to try to reach these favorable outcomes, then you do have this situation where like you're kind of working off of a map that your scout gave you that's overly optimistic. And so I think you do want to be in a situation where the map is quite accurate, but you're motivated to sort of go where you want to go, rather than, oh, I have a map which says that there's you know, a freeway straight through there, but it's actually up over a mountain. Like you want to know that there's a mountain there. And I think that's something that's very important. And so this kind of tied into this whole idea of reflection, because I think there's a big component of this sort of like trying to be more accurate in one's beliefs that runs through a lot of these particular reflective practices. So cognitive behavioral therapy is not just about like tell yourself what you want to hear, but how do you kind of challenge some of your beliefs? How do you like collect evidence for them? Like what would be the case if so-and-so really did hate you or something like this?
Yeah.
And mindfulness is also again about like, well, what is actually the reality? Like paying attention to your sort of sensory awareness as opposed to just, you know, ascribing beliefs to things. So I think there is a kind of common throughput in these reflective practices about this idea, which, you know, may actually be underrated. Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely think it is. Do you have any sort of final thoughts about this? Any advice that you have to people that want to start journaling today and like kind of how to go about it?
Yeah, I mean, I think the easiest way is to just set a habit of doing it daily, but doing very little. Okay. I think sometimes we can get in this, like, I want to sit down for half an hour and do some journaling, but then you never find half an hour and it's very hard to do it. Whereas if you just get in the habit of writing very small amounts every single day, it just becomes more automatic to start writing. And so while it can be the case that like sitting down with your thoughts for an hour can lead you to different conclusions than spending 30 seconds quickly typing something on your phone, I think if you just get in the habit of starting, can be very beneficial. And so that was one of the reasons for this month I wanted to make the habit daily, because it is something that, you know, it just encourages you when you encounter these problems to like turn to these kinds of practices to help you through your problems.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for sitting down and having this conversation with me.
Yeah.
It's been really nice. And I really, really hope that those that are listening find these conversations valuable. If you do, please like and subscribe, and we're gonna keep going for a few more months until the project is over. Next month is Connection.
Yeah.
Ooh, that's gonna be a big one.
So we will talk to you next month. Thank you.
Bye.